Chapter 1. The First Meeting. The rain had begun quietly, almost shyly, like someone knocking at a door they weren't sure they had the right to open. At first it was only a fine mist, a trembling haze that softened the outlines of the city. But within minutes the sky surrendered its restraint. The downpour came all at once, sheets of silver hammering against cobblestones, racing down gutters, soaking the city in a blur of sound and light. Adrian pulled the collar of his coat higher, his camera bag slung across his shoulder as he dashed beneath the iron arches of the old seaside train station. The station was not large, more of a relic than a working hub, a place where only a handful of trains passed each day, their whistles echoing against the sea cliffs nearby. But it had charm, rusted lanterns hanging from beams, faded tiles with blue and gold mosaics that hinted at another era, and windows streaked with rain that looked out over the restless horizon. He stood there for a moment, catching his breath, watching the rivulets slide down the glass. His mind was already composing frames, the contrast of iron and water, the lonely glow of the lamps, the sense of forgotten time clinging to the walls. Photography was like that for him, a way to hold moments before they slipped away forever. And yet, despite all the images he had captured in cities across Europe, something in him remained restless, searching. The café at the far corner of the station glowed warmly against the gray. Its door was half open, releasing the aroma of coffee and pastries into the damp air. Adrian hesitated, brushing droplets from his hair, then stepped inside. It was small, intimate, almost like a living room disguised as a public space. Shelves of books leaned precariously against the walls. A gramophone in the corner hummed faintly, though the record had long ended. A handful of travelers sat at tables, an elderly couple sharing tea, a young man scribbling in a notebook, a woman with a suitcase larger than herself. And then there was her. She was seated near the window, her hands wrapped around a porcelain cup, gazing out at the storm as if she were listening to music only she could hear. Dark hair tumbled in loose waves across her shoulders, a lock occasionally falling into her face, which she brushed aside with absent-minded grace. Her coat was a pale ivory, a little damp at the edges, but she didn't seem to care. What struck Adrian most was her stillness. In a room full of shifting bodies and clinking cups, she seemed entirely at peace, like the calm at the center of the storm. For a moment he didn't move. He simply watched her, as if afraid the act of blinking might make her vanish. What is it about her, he wondered. She looks like she's waiting for something, or someone. And then, just as if she had felt the weight of his gaze, her eyes turned. They were not startling at first, not the kind of eyes that demanded attention by color alone, but they had depth, the kind of depth that could make silence stretch and time slow. For a heartbeat, they held each other's stare. Adrian felt the world outside blur, the storm muffled to a distant echo. He was a man who lived by moments, and in that instant, he knew he had stumbled into one worth keeping. He cleared his throat, almost embarrassed, and made his way to the counter to order. "A black coffee, please," he told the barista, his voice lower than usual. He sat at the table closest to hers, not so close as to intrude, but close enough that he could still feel her presence, like a magnetic pull. He opened his notebook, pretending to jot down ideas, though the pen hovered uselessly above the paper. She was the first to break the silence. "Do you sketch?" Her voice was soft but carried easily over the small distance. Adrian blinked, caught off guard. He looked at the blank page before him and gave a faint smile. "Sometimes, but mostly I take photographs." Her eyes flickered with curiosity. "Of people?" "Of everything," he replied. "But mostly moments, the ones that don't last." She tilted her head slightly, considering his words, then smiled faintly. "Moments don't last by nature. That's what makes them precious." Her answer surprised him, not because it was profound, but because it echoed something he had always thought but rarely heard said aloud. "And you?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. "What do you do?" She looked down at her hands, still curled around the cup, as if holding on to warmth. "I play the piano, and sometimes I write music." Adrian's lips curved into a half-smile. "So you create moments too, only yours last a little longer." "Not really," she said softly. "Music disappears the moment it's played, unless someone remembers." Their eyes lingered again, that unspoken recognition building like a bridge between two strangers. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, a fragile silence stretched. Not empty, but charged, as if the universe had paused to see what they would do next. The barista called an order, breaking the spell. Adrian took a sip of his coffee, gathering courage. "I'm Adrian," he offered, his voice deliberately casual, though his heartbeat had quickened. "Elena," she replied. He repeated her name quietly, as if testing its weight. "Elena." There was a pause, then she asked, "Do you often sit down and talk to strangers in train station cafes?" He chuckled. "Not usually. Do you often ask them if they sketch?" A spark of amusement glimmered in her eyes. "Touché." They laughed softly, and with that, the awkwardness dissolved. Conversation began to flow, halting at first, then with surprising ease. They spoke of the storm, of the way the city changed when it rained, of favorite cafes and hidden alleys near the harbor. Adrian found himself telling her about the old fisherman he had once photographed at dawn, how the man's eyes had held an entire ocean of stories. Elena told him about a concert hall she adored, with cracked marble floors that echoed under the weight of memory as much as music. They were strangers, and yet it felt like they had been waiting to speak to each other for far longer than this single evening. Dinner monologue. "Adrian, what am I doing? I don't even know her, but she feels familiar, like a melody I've heard once in passing, one that lingers in the back of my mind. Why do I want to keep listening?" Inner monologue, Elena. "There's something in his eyes. They're searching, restless, like he's never quite where he belongs, even when he's standing right in front of you. And yet, it doesn't scare me. It makes me want to know what he's looking for." The storm eased gradually, the thunder retreating, the rain softening into a whisper against the glass. Evening descended, lanterns flickering on outside the station. The cafe grew quieter as travelers caught their trains or gave up waiting and disappeared into the wet streets. Elena glanced at her watch and sighed. "I was supposed to meet a friend, but she canceled last minute. Looks like fate had other plans." "Fate?" Adrian echoed, raising a brow. She shrugged, a playful glimmer in her eyes. "Well, what else would you call this?" He wanted to answer, but words failed him. He only smiled, and she seemed to understand. By the time they rose to leave, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The world outside smelled fresh, like salt and earth cleansed by the storm. They stepped out together, side by side, without needing to decide it. Elena pulled her coat tighter, shivering slightly. Adrian instinctively offered his umbrella, holding it so it covered her more than himself. "You'll get wet," she said, glancing up. "I don't mind," he replied simply. They walked in silence for a while, their footsteps splashing softly against the slick cobblestones. The city shimmered with reflections. Lamps mirrored in puddles, neon signs bending in liquid colors. At the corner where their paths diverged, they stopped. "It was nice," Elena said, her voice hesitant, as though she wasn't sure if nice was the right word. "It was more than nice," Adrian admitted. "I don't usually—" He trailed off, then shook his head with a small laugh. "Never mind." She studied him, then smiled gently. "I don't usually either." A pause, a moment. The kind of silence that begged for either courage or surrender. "Would you—" Adrian began, then caught himself. He didn't want to sound presumptuous. "Would you like to meet again? Somewhere that isn't a train station?" Her smile deepened. "I would." And just like that, the fragile thread between them became something stronger, something that might just hold. They exchanged numbers, a quick scribble in his notebook, a careful saving in her phone. Then they parted ways, turning down opposite streets, yet glancing back almost at the same time, both smiling at the absurdity of their synchronicity. Adrian walked on, his coat damp, the night cool against his skin. But inside he felt strangely warm, as though the storm had left behind a spark only he could feel. He didn't know where it would lead, or if it would last. But he knew one thing with sudden certainty. This was a moment worth keeping. End of the first chapter. Subscribe and like this video so you don't miss the next chapter. And the second chapter will be about falling in love.